Go for it.
All right.
Oh, we're live now?
Yeah, we're live.
Oh, okay. Um, uh, hey everybody, I'm Silver Spook. I'm a native Hawaiian indie game developer and activist here on the Big Island of Hawaii. Um, uh, this is the Indigenous creators panel. So, and they've kind of asked me to kind of host, but I feel like we're gonna kind of like let it be a more comfortable conversation, relaxed sort of deal, and things will come up as they come up, I think. But yeah, I mean, I know my friend Tali there, but Miranda, it's good to see you on camera for the first time.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Miranda Dew. I currently am living in Los Angeles. I am from Broken Arrow originally. I'm a member of the Pawnee Nation tribe. I'm also Cherokee. And yeah, I currently work at Treyarch as an associate producer. So I'm happy to talk about my journey through the games industry and identity and gaming. So thank you so much for having me here today.
Yeah, kia ora everyone. My name's Talo, Talo Faulkner, I guess. I'm Faulkner and BC whānau and Naitarangi. I made a game last year called Omorangi Generation, did pretty well. I think it was the right game for the right time. It was sort of about looking at sort of the problems neoliberalism creates that's not really equipped to solve, if that makes sense. Just kind of the idea that, for example, with like climate change and COVID, there's a lot of, I think, overlap with how that was handled. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it all comes out of the same system. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, full disclosure, I have had several, at least two conversations with Tali on Twitch streams. And so, I'm sure we'll be getting back to some of the good old colonial or anti-colonial ground that we've covered before. But yeah, it's so I guess like Indigenous. I mean, I guess as an Indigenous creator, like it is kind of interesting. I just kind of think of like what specifically you're kind of start on. But I mean, for myself, I mean, I usually just kind of start from my own position as my positionality as like a Native Hawaiian and also somebody who was a social worker and a STEM teacher that like worked directly with kind of Indigenous communities, but poor and under-resourced communities like in Honolulu, in Hawaii, and in various parts of Hawaii, which I know a lot of people don't necessarily immediately think of poverty and homeless tent cities and just anomie and poisoned water that's full of lead and copper when you think of Hawaii. But I mean, that's what we have. It's Manhattan in the tropics in a lot of ways, and so my games are specifically like my experiences growing up as kind of ghettoized Native Hawaiian. While my parents taught at a very expensive private school right across the street from one of the former presidents. You might know him, Obama. And I only got to go there because I got I got like a free ride basically for $20,000. It was what it costs right now because my father taught there. And so, but we lived basically in the ghetto. It like my neighbors lived like 20 to a house, ate spam every night for dinner. And so it was a really like bizarre, just kind of like having the inequality just shoved in your face every day. So a lot of my games are specifically Neofeud is my, Silver Spoon Games is like basically me. I'm a one person like writer, musician, artist, programmer, half of the voice acting, sort of game dev. We're trying to expand, but that's how I made it. And it's basically my experiences and then teaching, doing social work, helping kids in the homeless tent cities, kids, just trying to keep them off of negative behaviors, away from drugs, like gang activity, and moving towards something better. Difficult, as Tali said, like under a kind of like a neoliberal hell world sort of situation, but I mean, as best as we can manage. So that's where I come from, and also I'm an activist here on the Big Island, where specifically the Mauna Kea, as a defender of Mauna Kea, our sacred mountain, against you may have heard in 2019, the biggest military and police action ever in Hawaii was against Native Hawaiians here. 8,000 of us were arrested. They were up to and including Air Force military aircraft were dropping 15,000 bombs of C4 equivalent, not on our heads, but I mean 6 miles from us, to threaten us, and militarized police, everything you can imagine. So my side of things is trying to like speak truth about what it's like to be an actual Indigenous Native Hawaiian person in a world which trillions of dollars of marketing goes into trying to sell Waikiki vacations and 51st dates and all the blue Hawaii and all of that, and trying to, I'm like one is just trying to be some kind of voice like against a lot of that marketing is kind of what I do. And but yeah, anyways, Miranda, I'll be interested, like, I mean, how has it been for you, like in the game industry? Like, I mean, I feel like you've been in it probably longer than any of us.
Yeah, it's been challenging for sure. I guess like I was very blessed, and I was able to attend a variety of different like pre-college programs. So that's kind of how I got my start. Was in high school, knowing that I wanted to make games. Um, I thankfully also have a cousin who's a game designer, so that's kind of what opened my eyes up to this industry in general. But um, I'm from Oklahoma, and like video games as an occupation was very unheard of. It's not something I ever saw really like growing up. It wasn't until I was older that I was like, oh, that's a really cool thing that I could possibly do. Um, and then I went to USC and did the games program. So I've felt like, I've been very, pointed with what I wanted to do with my life, which has definitely helped. But like now that I'm working in the games industry, there are definitely a lot of challenges when it comes to like, how does my personal identity play into this? I rarely see Native American people in video games, especially not in AAA games, and especially not characters that like have a lot of meaning towards the narrative or towards the story. So that's something that's pressing on me, like what can I do as a developer to help make sure that representation's there. And I think it is hard because I am one person and a giant company, and one person in this industry, there's so many people, and it often feels like the weight of the future of Indigenous people represented in this field is on my shoulders, as well as the handful of other Indigenous game developers I know. And there's plenty of Indigenous game developers, and I'm really blessed to have been able to meet a lot of them through various groups. But we are a small handful of people, just trying to do what we can with um, whatever place in life we are. But it can be very exhausting, just like I want to start Indigenous group at my employee network group at my workplace. I'm the only person I know until just yesterday. Someone was posting like, oh hey, I'm Indigenous, like is there a group? And I was like, excuse me, hi, I'm the other one. Let's start a group. So it's slow, but it is exciting to kind of be able to have a platform for these topics.
I think yeah, something I kind of think about a lot, just reflecting on sort of my basis is not necessarily in games. It was more I started working for a university after I graduated, and they wanted me to make apps, and I just said, yeah, I know how to do that. And just sort of like I knew a little bit, but move more into that side of it. But I guess the thing I kind of think about is like, you can probably tell from my accent, I guess I mainly grew up in Australia, and something I kind of always think about with that is, I kind of got it pretty easy in terms of like, yeah, like we kind of lived pretty not great, but like I didn't have, I guess, the full frontal assault of racism growing up that, many of my Aboriginal friends have, right? And I kind of think that there's, like, it's interesting because it's like that societal barrier is something that's very like specific to that nation state. Like the thing I kind of always think about is Australia has sort of built all of its racism around the other and things like that. But because they haven't really built much around Maori people, you're starting to see a lot more Maori people pop up in Australian media rather than like Aboriginal people. But that's just my observation anyway. But I think it's this interesting thing that, I had a friend who he organized getting sort of, a welcome dance or a war dance or whatever started in the like the start of the rugby, right? Like we obviously have the haka and everything like that, but he got with the sticks and the dancing and stuff like that. And the immediate response from a lot of Australians was, why would we want that? We're just copying Maori people. And it's like, come on, all right. It was this sort of interesting thing, I think, just talking about Australia, but I think there's probably something similar to that in the game space as well. Like you're talking, Miranda, about the raise your hand if you're Indigenous and there's two people, and then I assume that there would be, you've probably had that scenario at some point where someone's come up to you and asked you to speak on behalf of not just Pawnee, but every nation in America, and try and condense that down, even though it's probably their job to do that and do that consultation, but they're just trying to wave it off. Like I think, sorry, I must just be ranting at this point, but Spook's used to it. He should have warned you all. But I think it's just an interesting sort of thing where I remember seeing a certain industry professional a few months ago saying, why is it you guys always say it's not our job to educate you, but when we ask you, he had a bit of a whinge for that. But the idea is that, well, if you want us, hire us and put us in those positions. Don't like try and turn it around where, Miranda, you're working as producer. This person should be trying to, work with you in this kind of space, I guess. But yeah, I don't know. I think about that stuff a lot. I don't know if I answered the question there. I think I've derailed this one, but yeah.
Oh no, I mean that's all relevant. I mean, I think it's interesting because I don't know. I'm coming like more. I have worked in like bigger companies, like basically single A, triple A, and also nonprofit and government. I've worked in a variety of different jobs, but then it's it's like a different experience, for each of us. Also we're in like 3 different countries, I was just recently talking to some other like Asian and Pacific Islanders specifically who are working in a variety of contexts, just trying to like, just a little bit branching off from specifically just Indigenous, but somebody saying like, I was working in Asia and basically my entire job is to like take Chinese games or Chinese software and de-Chinesify it, right? Just rip out whatever is remotely resembling that culture so that it's consumable for the West, basically. And I was like, that's your whole job? I mean, like, yeah, because like, it just kind of like this, and I think there's similar things happening with indigeneity. It's kind of like, if you are palatable, let's say, palatable to particular Western sensibilities, you say the kind of the right things. You don't make people too uncomfortable in the game company or in any kind of company, but particularly media. They kind of accept you. But if you start asking, well, let's talk about how about that fossil fuel pipeline that's coming through our lands? How about let's talk a little bit about the actual history of colonialism and what we can do about that. Then it's kind of like, well, I don't know if we're going to we don't need that kind of form of indigeneity in our company. That's not really acceptable to the, what we're trying to sell. We're trying to sell video games. We don't want politics in our video games, right? And it's like, my existence is political. That's one thing I know it's like, it's a difficult issue, particularly if you're just trying to get more people like into like the games industry. Like, from Miranda's perspective. And that was one of the pushbacks that, not pushback, but like one person was like, Silver Spook, I love what you're doing, making this game about your experiences. And it's very overtly like capitalistic, anti-imperialistic. But I have a company of 50 people. Like somebody in the Philippines. I was like, I just need people to have jobs here. And in order for it to be palatable, we can't really, we need to sell to Western audiences. We can't sell enough here. So we need to make games that are palatable. And I really wish I could do more, but I can't run this company and actually make honest games about my Filipino culture. And it was kind of sad, but it's also like, I also get it, and anyway, I'm kind of
had that thought when I was making the Monongi generation, because the idea around that was like, Maori designs are always ripped off it's been ripped off heaps in video games. We've always seen the tribal Game Boy DS or whatever, or Game Boy SV or whatever. Anyway, but I guess the thing I was kind of thinking around with that game was like, if people are going to, because I did see some people go in and they did try to do the tourist thing where they were thinking, oh, it's like someone had told them it's going to be, it's an Indigenous game. But I think the strength of that game was to sort of pull them in, but then sucker them in with saying, well, this is actually what you guys are doing. And like, this is what the result of that is. We're going to actually focus on this now. I mean, there's like the bait and switch that game has, like in the midway point. Just for anyone who's not familiar, the game sort of has a switch midway where it's not necessarily a tonal shift, but it's more of a waking the audience up to sort of see what was in front of them already. Like the idea is sort of that, there's a great book called Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe, right? And he's an Aboriginal man who talks about this idea that when Europeans came to Australia, it's not that they saw the, primitive wanderer or whatever, it's that they couldn't see civilization in front of them. But contained within a lot of their diary entries is the sort of evidence that there was, roads and rivers and, like running water and, like crops and irrigation and stuff and all this sort of stuff that sort of was there to begin with. And I think the idea was to sort of flip that around and show sort of the idea that it's all there to begin with, is you just need sort of your eyes open to be able to see it. Like if you've got the blinders on, the idea is to sort of like use that, but then once they're off, it's like the people playing can't necessarily pick it back up. Like I think the funniest thing about all that was I saw a tweet where someone got to the very last level of the DLC, which is sort of a very like explicitly like, let's look at the nature of protest or anti-fascism, and they went, what the fuck, this game's political? It's like, what are you going to do there, yeah, I think just thinking about what you were saying there, it's kind of like the thing I always think is, I think the idea that games shouldn't be political or whatever, like there's a really great opportunity there to sort of like rope people in, I think, in terms of like if they don't expect that, like catching them off guard might be a way of sort of giving them a bit of a shock or a fright that helps them sort of explore that issue through the game itself. Because I think twists in any form of media are something that usually hook people in, sort of regardless of where they come from. And I think like it's sorry, I'm not great with words, but I think it's that idea of like with these sort of subjects, it's like I feel like people do want to consume this stuff, but a lot of the times they've been told not to. Like if you did say, like, for example, an anti-capitalist critique, but you didn't mention the word capitalist at all, with the sort of like, people who say they don't like or like their capitalism stands, or they say they don't like politics, would they actually pick up on it? I think that they probably wouldn't pick up on necessarily that it's an anti-capitalist thing, but they would probably agree with the message and probably promote that as a really healthy thing. That's just my thinking anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like I don't put that on the Steam page. Like, get Neophyte. It's a super political game. No, I just say this is a cyberpunk adventure game. Do you like William Gibson and Ghost in the Shell references? And it's like Disco Elysium, but more cyberpunk and like 20,000 times less bugs than that's 2077 thingy. But anyways, yeah, it's like I mean
2077 less bugs maybe. No.
Yeah, there's only like less than 7 bugs. I don't know. But yeah, it's yeah. I mean, it is definitely like trying to like kind of like you don't have to you don't have to always like open with kind of like lead people in with the spoonful of sugar of just like look at this aesthetics with big capital letters, and then it's kind of like maybe you'll learn something. I mean, I think a lot of really good media does that, particularly if you want to move people. It's a good way. But anyways, Miranda, I did want to ask you like about like, I mean, full disclosure, like Elizabeth LaPonce was I think I'm saying that right, was the one that kind of reached out to me, and I owe a lot to Beth for like hooking him up with a lot of the Indigenous devs. I mean, like like in the wider industry, I mean, because I worked for a period of time, but I haven't really been like mostly I've worked out of Hawaii, to be honest, and I was just like wondering like we have like there's some indigenous or just indigenous devs, indigenous game devs groups. But like, I don't know, do you know of, like, how do you see that kind of like building out? Like, are there any kind of like coalitions or like, I heard John Romero wants everybody to come. John Romero is also indigenous, I be Mexican and part indigenous. And Elizabeth just told me like John wants everybody to come to his house or something like this. I don't know. Maybe that's
Yeah, we're all going to Ireland for
we're all
our
going to
All right.
Ireland.
Okay.
gathering. Yeah, so I've been a part of the Indigenous game developers group probably since like 2012, 2013. It's kind of when I met Elizabeth, and she's been absolutely amazing, like an amazing leader of the Indigenous game dev community. It's through her that I've had, many opportunities. She's helped me get internships and speaking opportunities, and I think it's people like that that can really help um, help our community out. And now that I'm in a place where I can also do stuff like that, I definitely look up to her as a role model for how I can help other Indigenous devs. But it is, there's not many like big communities for us, and I feel like every now and then, someone kind of pops up on the scene and we're like, oh, they're Indigenous, like get them in the group. But it's definitely like one of those kind of more disenfranchised things, because Indigenous captures a lot of people from a lot of backgrounds, a lot of similarities, but our group is so different. There's North American Indigenous people, uh, First Nations, Indigenous people from pretty much all over the world, which is really cool. And it's been really cool to like be able to meet people through that. I think um, I've personally, like, I've said that I was going to make like a Indigenous special interest group for the International Game Developers Association, but I don't have time right now. And so it's
Yeah.
like one of those things is like we would love to have more, you know, um, more like solidified organizations and groups, but it all lies, on our shoulders. Like, so it's kind of based on like when we have time, and when, other people have time to do these things. So I'm hoping that, there can be more representation, but it's not there. I mean, we've seen great strides in the games industry, like in terms of diversity. Like we're starting to see companies put money where, um, where it matters. But like I think there's one GDC scholarship for Indigenous developers, and that's through Imaginative, and that was kind of like started by people in the Indigenous game group because we had connections there. So I think it's important that people realize that these are fruits of our own labor, and we need more help. We need these big companies to come up and say like, hey, we want to support Indigenous game devs. We want to provide scholarships for our students, that are specifically for the Indigenous community. So I hope to see more strides in that in the future.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Agree.
yeah, thanks to Gay Gaming Pros, of course, for even having this panel, and all the work that you
Yeah.
and Elizabeth have like put into this, because I mean another one of my Indigenous friends, we all I think know Megan Byrne,
Yeah.
through the Indigenous game devs, who also is working on some really cool games. I'm really excited to play. I mean, it's very, I do like cyberpunk games from an Indigenous perspective. Megan Byrne is also working on, it's like cyber noir. Like it's very
Yeah.
similar. I've seen a lot of like kind of some of the work on that. I want to play it on one of my streams one of these days. And so, but similarly, like I think some of the, like the funding, it was like you kind of said, like this kind of handful of Indigenous people who really wish they had more time, right?
Yeah.
But at least you getting something done. So yeah, I mean, we're all just doing the best that we all can manage. But yeah, I kind of cut you off, Tali. Yeah.
Oh no, I was just agreeing with Miranda there. I think that's I guess an interesting thing. I know that with like how the sort of the first generation of indie developers, I guess, they're the ones that really hit it out big. I remember that they did a thing, what was it called, the indie grant or something, where it was like they all would just sort of pitch in 10% of their giant enormous amounts of money, and then if someone made a game, the idea was they would make the game and then pour it back in, I guess, like you know what I mean, like if you made a game with the grant, you would sort of like re-put some back in to sort of grow it there. But I wonder, the thing I always kind of think about with game stuff is like, are our ways actually just better than the ways that are sort of already there to begin with? Like, I'm sort of in pre-production on this next game, and rather than sort of doing a sort of RNG based metric on sort of procedural generation and stuff, the thing I've sort of more landed on is actually more like patterns, like weaving patterns, because there's still not necessarily the RNG to it, but more of the pattern of randomness from when you do the twist and the fold and stuff like that. And I for one, I'm really into the idea of like building games from the ground up to have that sort of like what would you call it, like that thinking in the ground when you do it. Like I think like Spook had the he was on a call with me and Tim once, so he knows what we're like. We were in the same room together. We had a call about a week ago, and we were sort of talking about this idea of like building this game really from like Maori assumptions and Maori like ways of doing and stuff like that. And this idea of because not to spoil anything about that game, but it's this idea that eventually the English language or Western ways of thinking runs out. Like it can't go to where it needs to go. Like I guess the idea I'm sort of thinking of there is sort of like when I was working at a university, we were sort of really into the idea of remapping the Indigenous knowledge course. And the idea around that was eventually we had to abandon using English words because they couldn't accurately describe what we were talking about. They were not capable of describing the sort of things. And, when I'm talking with Tim, I was sort of talking about the idea of we're going to have to start looking at like whakapapa and stuff because it can't go to that space. And I think, thinking, just reflecting, we're on the Gay Gaming Pros Twitch stream at the moment, there's that same thing as well that, our ways of doing had different conceptions of what gender was, and the language represented that, like our words for, gender identities and things like that and stuff like that was much broader than what the English language was. And I think it's just, I guess, something I kind of think about that, if we as Indigenous game developers are building games from the ground up with these, I guess, layers built into it, we're going to get different results. We're going to get games that people had kind of never really like had before because it's going to be the sort of thing that the difference is like foundational. That's what I think anyway.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Oh, there's a question for everyone. What are some of the toughest challenges that you've come across or seen in the Indigenous game making? Yeah, I mean, I guess toughest challenges. I mean, like for me specifically, like let me tell you, well, working full time as a social worker and a STEM teacher, and I bring this up a lot, but yeah, working full time, and I was like literally living in a van for part of the time. Part of it was literally living, unfortunately, next to the next lab above the highway, paying $1,500 for that in well, any city in America, but in Honolulu, in my hometown, trying to like pay rent and put food on the table while making games was a challenge. So funding is definitely a challenge. So like, if people can't get grants, they can't get any kind of support to not have to struggle to pay for your existence rent, as we would say. That helps a lot. That was a big challenge, but at the same time, that informed like the game that I did make. But I mean, like definitely like when I was working for bigger companies, like I remember like it's literally working on some of the card games that when you open up your Windows accessories, and it was like like Blackjack, Texas Hold'em, and it was like the biggest creative input that I ever got to put in was like, should we put the suicide Jack's knife on the left or right side of the head? That's it. It's like, can we talk about, how about we talk about, can we make some other kinds of games? Like, let's make games that talk about like my experiences as a native Hawaiian. We're making this game in Hawaii. I mean, like, no, we can't touch anything like that. I mean, can we like, no, just make like Flappy Bird 76, make the next clone, make Bedazzled or Bejeweled or Among Us 3.7. And then if you don't do that, we're going to hire another underemployed Gen Z work for $3 an hour or kudos until they're ground to a fine paste. It's like, it was basically like, oh, okay. And that was part of my impetus to kind of like, I got to kind of like do my own thing here before I kind of like lose it fully. So that was a major challenge for me, was just struggling to kind of like just get by. I mean, one thing I will say is like now I now live on the Big Island of Hawaii, which is it's different to kind of like how do we put this? Just like very difficult cost of living and the amount of hours you need to work. Just trying to exist on the Big Island. It's a kind of a different sort of world. So we have more space and time. And the Silver Spit Worker Cooperative, which we currently, it's me, myself, and my partner, and we're bringing another one of my native Hawaiian. He is currently a homeless Hawaiian in Hawaii, and he's going to be coming to live with us soon and work with me on these games. And so just having like, I mean, this is kind of retreading some ground we already went on, but just having the sovereignty and agency, which is like, it's a lot of it's just like material. Unfortunately, under the current system, we have to pay for, you know, the housing and the food, electricity, and keeping the lights on. That was like, and now that we're in a place to like build from that, I'm like, I'm working on a couple different projects, and I feel like we have kind of like a little bit of soil to actually plant it in. So I'm not like literally just like trying to like it's like planting it's like planting a seed in the highway, you know, hoping that a car doesn't run it over or it gets like burnt to a crisp by the scorching hot sun. That's what I felt like living in the concrete Manhattan in the tropics of Honolulu. So, but anyway, yeah, you can all can answer that question though. What's the hardest?
Do you want to go first, Miranda, or should I?
You can go.
Okay. Well, because my experience is mainly not in the gaming industry. I only really joined this industry like last year, start of last year. So I can probably talk a little bit more from in the academy, because I think that's still relevant in how a lot of those hierarchies work and stuff like that. I guess the thing that you have to realize in the academy is everyone's an expert of something. So, you know, so-called, I guess. But there's always this sort of thing that when a lot of academics get into a room, they all sort of want to flex their PhD or whatever, right? And I think the interesting part about that was, how do you teach someone who thinks they already know like everything? Because I think with a lot of these sort of things, you know, if you're talking to someone who's let's say a psychologist, they have sort of a inbuilt worldview where they've already figured it all out in their head. And so the thing for us was sort of like, how do you tell them, well, like a really basic example, right, is how do you tell them to refer to an elder as uncle or auntie? Because in their mindset, uncle or auntie is restricted purely to, you know, like a hereditary, like a thing like that. And, you know, it was that kind of thing where, like, the way I started explaining to them is, so I just said, well, you know how with some churches they call the priest father. Oh yeah, I know that. Well, it's the same sort of thing. It's just a thing of respect, and it's done like that. Oh, okay, that makes sense. And then they started doing it, right? I think that there's just this, I guess, really interesting thing in that space that a lot of people I don't think want to learn, because this is just my running theories. I think a lot of the times when our stuff has been talked about, it's not been talked about by us. It's been talked about by, you know, either a teacher in a classroom who has to move it on in 4 weeks to the next topic, or, you know, just the inbuilt racism of nation states, right? And I think it's one of those things where when we can be in those positions to tell it, I guess there's always, I guess, a little bit of a tricky situation with that. Because I guess the other thing I sort of think about is, as someone who worked, you know, at a uni, it was like, there's always a layer of protection you need to put on what you say, because in universities, everyone always wants to own everything, right? Everyone's always looking for that next thing to make them, you know, rigorous, or, you know, sort of elevated in that, you know, academic space. And so I think there's always, I think there's a little bit of overlap, I think, with games, because like I know that, you know, it's only, I think, a matter of time until Indigenous stuff becomes a little bit fetishized in gaming. Like, you know, there's sort of the idea that it's the in thing to go with. Like I've seen it, you know, obviously with Maori designs, with, you know, say surfboards and, you know, just whatever. And I think that eventually we'll probably see that in gaming as well. And I think the fear I have is sort of that, like, in that space, are people going to only really absorb the surface message? Like I kind of think about, the idea of civil rights and things like that, when that's put in games, oftentimes it's sort of the very very elementary stuff from the 20th century, right? I don't think that's necessarily bad, but I think a lot of the times the way it's often presented is sort of as if that stuff hasn't necessarily grown in terms of the problem's still there, but like it's moved into a different beast. Like obviously with like militarized police, that's gotten much more violent with the police. With say for example the advent of social media, people can now share that, and like Black Lives Matter today is very different from the sort of you know sit-ins and stuff from the 1960s, but it's still, I think, the same, I guess, ancestry, if that makes sense. Um, so like, I think about that stuff because like, I know that eventually, we'll start to see this stuff pop up in games, and I guess my thinking is it going to be sort of the colonized sort of way of it? Like, is it going to be um, the way it's discussed? Is it going to be sort of like put into its box, and it's the very kind of as Vic was sort of talking about earlier, the sort of safe talking points of let's not talk about pipelines or for example in Australia, and you could use example like back home as well, but it's that idea of like nothing's necessarily changed in terms of legislation around a lot of this stuff. If you like, I had a really great teacher who um, he showed me sort of this is the legislation from the last 200 years in Australia, and for the most part, the only thing that's really changed is the officer's salary. Um, the idea of like the assimilation policies and stuff versus now, there's not really that much difference to them. And like his critique was always this idea of constitutional recognition is essentially ceding your sovereignty to the idea that you are now a colonized person. As an Aboriginal people haven't ceded their sovereignty, and writing them into the constitution, he argued was more of this idea that you're now fully embracing and accepting where you sit in their space. So I don't know. I always think about that stuff because it's really interesting around this idea that like when this stuff does get put in games, sometimes it is just the like year 5 or grade 5 version of it, and it's not necessarily the sort of message that needs to go out right now. I kind of think there was that David Cage Android game. Everyone's heard me talk about this a lot, but it's that idea of like the David Cage Android game was very much a like, let's look at 1960s civil rights because it's safe to do now. Like it's very safe to talk about this subject matter, not necessarily this idea that like this is the discussion being had around racism in modern neoliberal nation states. It's instead all the stuff that we can now all like, for example, when I say all, we can all now see, it's that idea that like even conservatives can now say busing was bad, police brutality was bad, but if you sort of were to present that to them today, there's this grind that some people are going to have against that. I don't know. I think about that stuff, but yeah. To answer the question, I can't really sort of talk much about those challenges because I've only been here for about a year and things have gone quite smooth so far.
Yeah, I guess I'll talk a little bit about some challenges. I remember when I was in college and still just trying to figure out like my identity. For some background, I was adopted outside of the Pawnee Nation. So I didn't really grow up with a lot of the traditional customs and traditional experiences that a lot of, people from my nation do grow up with. So it wasn't until I was in college where I was reunited with my biological family. And it wasn't until then that I really felt like I could have real ownership of my identity. So I definitely struggled with that personally. But then alongside that, I remember in college, I was like trying to pitch a game. Um, and it was about, like Pawnee myths. And it was kind of I was trying to do like a narrative focused Indigenous game. And I just remember at that time, like I was posting about it on one of the Facebook groups for the students, and some like engineering PhD student was like, narrative driven games aren't really the types of games that we want to work on as engineers. And I just remember being like, first of all, I'm like one of 3 women in my year, which is intimidating enough. Second of all, I'm a person of color, and I don't have any other Indigenous game developers, especially not here at the school. Um, and then, I'm not an engineer. I am, a designer, a producer. So I just remember stuff like that, like just always happening and being like, is my story worth telling? Is it worth, me putting up all this heartache to get something made without, the support of my peers, without the support of, whatever. Is it worth it to tell that story? Because it's a personal thing. It's my story. Um, and it's just, I don't know, there's a lot of heartbreak when stuff like that happens. So through school, that was definitely a challenge, was like, how do I, remain authentic to my identity without getting hurt, without, having to, potentially water down an idea or like change a story just so it's palatable to people to get them to work on it. Stuff like that was really challenging. I think things have changed a lot in the past 2 years. I remember when I was a senior, or I was a super senior, I took 5 years. And like seeing the freshmen and sophomoreans and like just how different they were, in the sense that they were just so interested in narrative games. They had all these wide interests, just all these things that they were exposed to things differently than when I was. Even that, like 4 years of age difference really changed a lot in the games industry. So I'm definitely really hopeful for the future, and I hope that I can help cultivate a space where it is easier for people to tell their stories. It's easier for people to share their identity and be supported. There's some great organizations that are doing work to help elevate those stories, like the Pixels organization. I sit on the selection committees for picking out, who is getting funding for that. I sit on uh, um, scholarship committees. I was on the scholarship committee for the Entertainment Software Association, and making sure that we have an Indigenous voice in those places that are helping elevate um, other people, I think is super important. And I mean, there's definitely scholarships I've applied to, and I've talked to people that run those, and they're like, we just quite frankly don't have Indigenous people on the panel because we don't know any Indigenous people that like have the requirements for you know evaluating these types of things. So I think it's just definitely baby steps. And I'm just hoping that I can continue to do what I can to help people tell their stories. And as for like my personal work and the stories I want to tell, like I think that will come eventually when I'm ready. I'm really enjoying, working on Call of Duty, and hopefully pushing, Indigenous representation and the AAA spheres where I can. But I do think someday I would like to attempt to tell some more stories related to my life and my identity and my background. Um, so I think it's always gonna be challenging, but I'm definitely hopeful for the future.
I think, sorry, if I can just
Yeah.
think a little bit about that. Like, I think one of the things I think about a lot is like not the barrier for entry, the sort of I'm thinking about game engines 10 years ago, and they were just unreachable for most people, right? Because it was either they had a huge paywall, like a couple of $1,000, which if you're like a student or just someone that's really hard to get into. Whereas now most of them are free and everything like that. And I think like I'm just sort of relating this back to what I usually heard at the university, which was this idea of why do I need to learn that, or why would I want to do that, right? Sort of similar to like what you're saying with this person saying we don't want to do narrative games, right? In most academic literature around games, they talk about 4 main ideas around games, which is like crafted work of art, narrative, game core game, and sort of traditional games, right? If you're saying that you don't want to do narrative games, you're missing out on like 1/4 of the entire industry sort of game space. Like I always think about it more in this idea, because that's the way we started framing it where we worked, which was, so you're saying you don't want to work with Indigenous people. Okay. You're saying that you don't want to work with 10% of the population. And not necessarily that, but if you're talking about the idea of cultural competency as a whole, that's even more, the idea that you're not just working within your own cultural context, you're working with cultures, from around the world.
Yeah.
And I think framing it like that's much more, strengths based and positive around, this idea. Because I think narrative games are only growing, because I think the idea is that as this sort of barrier for entry with cost, and also like with Unity, they're introducing visual scripting. How good's that, right? People don't have to spend years of their life learning a language that's going to be outdated in 10, right? Or you know what I mean? Like, because these languages, they get updated and they change, right? I think it's going to be this interesting thing, though, that, we're going to start to see stories that couldn't be told because of the technical ability. And, we all know Uncle John Romero or whatever. But, his whole thing is he got in pretty early there. And it was really good that he got that foothold nice and solid in that space with a game that's, obviously people call it the granddaddy of first-person shooters and stuff. But I think we're going to start to see more, I guess, games made by, different people over the years now that it's sort of opened up like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like it's making games is far more accessible. Like every year it gets easier and easier to learn it from at home and do things kind of on your own, which is really fantastic. It gets rid of a lot of barriers for people who do want to tell their own stories. Like I'm really interested in doing a little bit more work on like Twine and kind of doing more visual novel work, because that's definitely something, I personally, as someone that hasn't touched Unity in 4 years, can manage a lot easier than jumping into a whole engine right now. But I think that there's a lot of excellent opportunities for people to kind of get their foot in the door, and we can keep doing everything we can to make it even easier.
Yeah. I was just thinking of, just speaking of like other games, because if you're somebody watching and you're like, are there any, what kind of indigenous games are there out there? Speaking of Twine, I believe 1870 Cyberpunk Forever is a free game. I believe it's made in Twine. In my opinion, it's the best Cyberpunk game ever made. It's fully indigenous, anti-colonial Cyberpunk game made by indigenous person from Paraguay, Santo Avero Ojeda, who I believe you folks might know. But it's and it's it was made with, it's a narrative game. It's specifically a game. It only takes you 20 minutes to play. I recommend anybody, if you have 20 minutes, just do check it out. It's like, can you it's basically it's a cyberpunk dystopian collapsing, kind of like Western neoliberal sort of society is just falling apart at the seams. And you play somebody who is evacuating kind of the city as it's dying. The artificial intelligences are like that are running the all of the giant mega corporate mining operations are just like imploding, and you have to try to you're trying to survive as kind of like as LA and New York and Texas like implode as they are right now, kind of, but just like even more late stage of that. And you're trying to, and then you find this indigenous society that is utilizing technology, which is an important thing that like needs to be discussed as well. But we're going to run out of time soon. But indigenous futurism, where Black Panther the movie has done a lot of important work there. But it's something that I personally am looking at for Near Future too. Is what does an indigenous future look like? It looks a lot like what Vietnam is, which is it's a place full of the people that have been existing there for thousands of years. And they have more advanced technology and have better quality of life than the average American. You can look that up later on. But an indigenous future, where people are living in this area of Paraguay in the mountains, with animals and plants integrated with like like wires and vines like living together, not in an extractive way, right, with like giant fossil fuel corporations and imperial colonial mining operations, taking over countries, extracting all the resources, leaving the indigenous people devastated and poor, but living in harmony with technology in an authentically like indigenous way. And you have to try to not be a colonizer coming up to these people and not assuming that they're backwards, that they're barbaric. Because if you do, they'll sense that they'll sense your hostility. And it's a really interesting game where it's like, can you like not be a colonizer for like 20 minutes and get through the game? And it's like basically if you can't like respect another culture, despite it looking different, right? Despite it having different dress and different ways of doing things, and not like kind of pigeonhole them into a box. It was a game that like really, it really did change a lot of the ways that I thought about technology, thought about what is possible in the game. It's very short. Like, I mean, some people, it's made by one person, like Neophyte as well. I mean, over a shorter span of time. But I mean, it does to me. It's kind of like this is like a completely different take on a cyberpunk future, but from an indigenous perspective. And anyway, I just want to kind of throw that. So there are a lot of these games. I want to give a shout out to Babby Goth at BABBYGOTH on Twitter, and well, Tali's already here, so.
Oh, hey, I obviously know Babby Goth too, and I think they're going to do some really good stuff in the future, which is it's going to be good. I think about, like, one thing I find is really interesting is, like, we often use cyberpunk as a genre a lot. I think it's because that genre itself has a lot of really great tools to sort of explore this stuff. For reference, my next game's not going to be cyberpunk, but I think it's got the right, like, framework to sort of piece together, like, what's going on in that space. But I think it's really interesting that sort of, like, the cyberpunk game that came out in the 80s was made by someone who was African American. I think that's really telling of why that genre stuck, because he was able to sort of, like, apply a lens to 1980s America and show sort of the I guess cruelty of the space. And I think that's probably why this, I guess, genre tends to be such a great way of exploring this stuff, because it's always about showing, I guess, that maybe cruelty is not the word. What would you probably use, Spook? But it's that idea of, like, like with your game, it's that idea of, like, floating golf courses and stuff, eh? And it shows that, like, really transparently what these sort of, like, plutocrats and that are doing in Hawaii. Like, for me, it was that whole thing of they are there on their expensive spaces and they are just looking beneath them and not doing anything about it because they don't give a fuck. Like, it's their like, the thing I kind of think about that is sort of like that idea of, okay, it's just a perfect critique of it, because that's exactly what's going on, right? You've mentioned plenty of times the sort of figures have come through there, and they're, like, I think you mentioned Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, and it's this idea that they've gone there and they've not done anything. They've gone there to just ignore reality, right?
Mark Zuckerberg unfortunately lives here in Hawaii. He is trying to kick on his 700-acre ranch that he didn't use for 10 years. He's trying to kick us off of our ancestral medicinal harvesting and fishing and gathering grounds. Larry Ellison owns an entire one of our islands. Bill Gates tried to buy all of Maui. I mean, I go for 6 hours regularly on these specific topics. But it's Hawaii is a very it's ultra America in all the worst ways, in a lot of way with it. Yeah, just imagine an indigenous community with a Disneyland built on top of it, and everybody forced to do basically fake versions, bastardized versions of their own powwows and their sacred dances for $7 an hour, while it costs $3,000 to live in a 2-bedroom if you're lucky. So, like, it's I have a lot of rage, and I'm gonna limit it because we only have 5 minutes. But I will say that, like, the cruelty is the point. Every criticism that you've kind of heard of, a lot of issues. I mean, you can leave the specific isms out of this. Just, like, look at the problems. That was all I was. That's why I came to Cyberpunk. I'm friends with William Gibson. I interviewed him as well, if you know that guy. And it was because I'm like, wow, you and Mike Pondsmith as well did a great job of capturing that. And it's really revealing the naked reality, with all the warts, with all of the PR airbrushing and all of the wallpaper, and this kind of like, oh, we're all better now, racial healing. Like, no, we're not healed, actually. Like, we're not healed. I don't feel very healed. My friend is literally, like, Neophyte was just, I went, you know what it is? Neophyte, I brought this up. I took pictures of the Kalihi Palama, where Dwayne The Rock Johnson, if you ever know who Dwayne The Rock, you ever heard of him? He was in a bunch of movies. Yeah, Joe, you heard of him?
I grew up during the 90s. I think I've seen him bash people. Yeah.
Where he used to steal Snickers and Twix by his own admission. The same 7-Eleven, Kalihi Palama. His dad was and uncles were big famous wrestlers down there. That's where I worked. I took pictures in this ghetto, and I drew a picture. This is the pawn shop. This is the payday loans place. This is the tent city. And then I just painted my own version of that. And that's where Neophyte feels so real, is because that I just take the label, oh, this is not Hawaii, because nobody would believe that because of all the billions of marketing spent on it. And so, and that's kind of if Neophyte does work, that's my game. If it does come across and work, it's because I tried to be as absolutely real as possible, but also kind of like making it as palatable as possible so people could get, funny and referencing, having a hippie Terminator and some, John Connor looking robot kid, mouthing off to cyborg social worker. But anyway, but I want to give Miranda, because we only got a couple of minutes left. Miranda, anything else you can tell us? Anything about John Romero that we need to know?
What's his phone number? No.
Yeah. What do people need to know? Well, I'm happy to chat with any, Indigenous developers, anyone trying to get in the industry, or anyone that just, feels like talking about anything. I'm on Twitter at Miranda Do. I'm happy to, share all my silly stuff on Twitter with everyone. But yeah, definitely check out the Indigenous Game Dev Association. There's a lot of awesome people involved there, and a lot of cool games coming out of all over the world, really. So I definitely recommend everyone look into that if you want to try some games that are, a little bit outside what you may find just naturally searching on Steam. We've got some great stuff, and yeah, I guess that's really it for me. I'm really excited for what the future has for everyone.
Yeah, go ahead, Tali. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, I think I share that same optimism because, like, I guess the thing I kind of think about a lot is how does the game space compare to film, right? Because my sort of, like, when I did my degree, it was mainly like film, but also like web design stuff. And obviously, if those two make a baby, it's apps, right? But the thing I kind of think about the film space is that there was that period sort of in the 70s and 80s, I guess, just after the 60s, where the sort of auteur filmmaker sort of popped up. And I think it was also that kind of space where voices other than the sort of like, white Hollywood man story was starting to be told. We started to see stories that were about people who were living, below the poverty line. We started to see stories that were, for example, like Dolomite, where it was this idea that it was black made and black owned and it was a black story, right? I think about that a lot in sort of the game space because I think we're starting to reach that point where the sort of game director is more of a role where people can start to see that it's a vision coming through rather than just someone who sort of managed the space. Because I guess the thing about that is that like it's getting there, yeah. So I'm really optimistic about that because I think we can all get into that space and start to deliver those stories, yeah.
All right. Anyway, so we're getting the wrap it up single. So
yeah,
but yeah, I mean that's totally true. I am Silver Spook, or also Chris. You can find me at Silver Spook Guy on Twitter, and also Silver Spook Games. And yeah, I mean this has been a great conversation. I'm sure we'll continue going into the future. Yeah, I mean Tali, you want to say like where we can find you?
Yeah, my Twitter handle's Selikov. It's pretty weird compared to where I'm sort of my name and everything. But you can either do that or you can just follow the game, which is Umurangi Game, UMURANGI Game on Twitter. And yeah, it's mainly we're just posting people's photos they've taken in the game. I guess I didn't really introduce the game. The game's a photography game. You take photos and sort of explore a world. Yeah, and so we're really excited for that because we're going to be releasing on the Switch this year. So that's going to be great. Yeah.
Right on.
Great.
All right.
All right.
Thanks a
Bye,
lot.
everyone.
Bye, everybody.